quite a few people missed out on marks in this question because they focused too much in their answer on the way that Shireen might be feeling, so on why she might be nervous because there's a crowd or because she's performing against people who can perform well, or because she's expected, there's a high expectation that she'll do well. That's all relevant, it's all true, but it's not to do with the way she might perform physically. So make sure you read the question properly. The final 2 questions on the exam paper both worth 7 marks. So the longest questions involving long answers. As you can see from this section of the mark scheme, they're also marked in a slightly different way. So there's different bands that you can be marked in. And these bands are to do with how much you show that you understand what you're talking about, how well you present your ideas. So your spelling, your punctuation, your grammar does have an impact on how many marks you can get. And also the use here of specialist terms. So that's what I was talking about earlier, making sure you're using the correct terminology. You're not using simplistic words to explain what you mean. You're using the words that you've learnt in GCSE PE lessons. So the questions requiring a longer answer often involve a longer question, involve you reading more words to actually work out exactly what the question is asking and to pick out all the different points that they're looking for. Okay, so this question is talking about healthy lifestyles, which is a topic we covered right at the beginning of the year. And healthy lifestyle is made up of all different things. They've already mentioned regular exercise in the question. Okay, and that tells you then, when it says the other factors underneath, that tells you they are not looking for you to talk about regular exercise. They're looking for you to talk about anything else that contributes to having a healthy lifestyle. It's then asking you to explain the long-term benefits that these are going to have on health. So 7 marks available. You're looking to explain every point you make in detail, giving examples when you can. At least 3, possibly 4 different factors of a healthy lifestyle, all explained well, would pick you up those 7 marks. So if we look at this answer here, this is a 7 mark answer, 4 marks here. So this person has started off, they've identified a factor, balanced diet. Okay, they've then talked about what impact that's going to have. So they've talked about body shape, they've talked about not being overweight, and they've talked about vitamins and minerals, which is going to improve health. So they've given quite a lot of detail in that first point about balanced diet. They haven't just listed balanced diet and left it there. They've explained it. So they've picked up marks there. They've also given examples of foods that contain vitamins and minerals and foods to avoid. The second factor is avoiding drugs. So they've talked about the way that drugs could be harmful to the body, and they've talked about how the fact that this could help her performance. The third factor they've mentioned is limiting alcohol consumption. So they've given an example of how much alcohol might be appropriate, and they've mentioned how this can be beneficial as it will prevent damage of the liver and other organs. Here is another answer that achieved 4 marks. So I thought I'd give you a second example just to see how different people approached the same question. So again, this one started off talking about a balanced diet. They've talked about vitamins and minerals, and they've mentioned immune system. They've then gone on to mention a point that wasn't mentioned in the previous answer about active social life. They've talked about how this can help with feeling more positive, interaction with other people, and they've linked it to mental health, which is a really key part of overall health. It's not just about physical health, it's about mental health as well. The final point they've made is about not smoking, and what this person's done is that they've actually given an example of an illness that can be caused by smoking, and so they've suggested that Shireen could avoid this in the future. Another good answer. So keeping with the same question, I wanted you to see another answer that didn't quite pick up as many marks, and so I could explain why. So this person here, they have mentioned a balanced diet, as you can see, and they've talked about some of the components of a balanced diet, fats and carbohydrates. Not quite as much detail as the other answers in that area. They've then mentioned a second point here, amount of sleep, and they've talked about being able to rest and recover. So again, a bit of detail, not quite as much detail in their answers. The final part here, this section about speaking to her friends and speaking about Facebook, that part not picking up any marks for that section, not particularly relevant because it's implying that she needs to be more active rather than sitting down all the time, which is not something that Shireen needs to think about. So only 4 marks for that answer. And then the final answer I wanted to show you for this question is an answer that didn't actually pick up any marks at all, and that's because the person who's written the answer has missed the point of the question. They've missed this part about healthy lifestyle, and they've focused their answer too much on components of fitness and how this person's going to improve their sporting performance. So they've talked about cardiovascular endurance. They've talked about being able to run longer distances, the different sports. They've talked about flexibility and power. Okay, none of this is really to do with healthy lifestyle. It's not talking about the other factors outside of exercise. So that's why this answer didn't pick up any marks, unfortunately, for that question. So here's the full mark scheme for that question, 19D, and it gives you a list here of all the different factors contributing to a healthy lifestyle. So remember, regular exercise is out of the picture because that was mentioned in the question. So you could have picked from any of these things, some that weren't mentioned, such as good hygiene, low stress levels. Then looking down how this might benefit Shireen's long-term health. There was some mention in some of the answers of body shape. There was a lot of people mentioned diseases and how you could reduce the chance of getting diseases. Mental illness was talked about. A bit about recovery to do with sleep. And not so much about fitness levels, but that's something you could have talked about. This part here is quite useful. So it mentions there how you actually were expected to answer the question. So the first step was to identify the factor, give a description of what it is, and then an example of how it's going to benefit the health of Shireen in the long run. Right, here we are, the final question. Question number 20, again worth 7 marks. So this question's got a few points to it, a few parts that you needed to make sure you answered each part. So we're talking about the cardiovascular system, and we're talking about running. So the first part of the question is, what is cardiovascular endurance? So we're looking for a definition. You can see in this answer, this person has clearly defined what cardiovascular endurance is. So it's talking about the body working for long periods of time. To make their definition even better, it could have specifically mentioned the lungs and heart, because they're the parts of the body working particularly hard. The next part of the question is, how could it be measured and how could it be improved? 2 separate things, measured and improved. Okay, so we've got here, they've talked about improving using the aerobic training zone, which is 60 to 80% of maximum heart rate, and they've talked about a time frame as well. We've then got a section about how to measure. So 2 different tests have been measured, the Cooper 12-minute run and the multi-stage fitness test, also known as the bleep test. The next part of the question asks about the short-term effects of physical activity, sustained physical activity. So we're talking about over a longer period of time. And this person has picked up a few things here. So we've got increased breathing rate in there. So you're going to be breathing faster, increased heart rate, your heart is beating faster. And they've provided some explanation of that. So they've talked about blood being pumped to the muscles to keep them moving. And they've talked about breathing rate increasing so that gaseous exchange can take place faster. So a thorough answer there, use an explanation and with lots of detail and knowledge, showing that they understand the topic. 7 marks out of 7. This second example is a 3-mark answer. So here this person, they've attempted a definition, so they've attempted to answer the first part of the question. This whole section here is their definition. It's a bit long-winded. It picks up a mark for talking about how long someone can go on for, a long period of time, but it's a bit vague and it could have been done in 1 or 2 lines, that definition. Then underneath there's a bit of mention about measuring resting heart rate that could be used to assess somebody's cardiovascular endurance, so that's picked up a mark there. No mention of the other tests that could be used, and no mention of how cardiovascular endurance could be improved, so some marks dropped there. Then at the end we've got short-term effects. Unfortunately only 1 mark picked up there for aching muscles. Lots of marks missed for things like increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, increased blood pressure, those kinds of things are going on. Also things like sweating and reddening of the skin. So lots of potential marks missed out there, unfortunately. So here is the mark scheme for question 20. So you can see there exactly what you were looking for when you were writing this answer. So the first mark, 1 mark available for a definition. Then we've got up to 3 marks here available for the short-term effects. So things like heart rate, things like breathing rate, things like blood pressure, temperature rising, sweating, going red. We've then got 2 marks, up to 2 marks available for mentioning accurate tests for measuring cardiovascular endurance. And we then have another up to 2 marks available for talking about how to improve cardiovascular endurance. So talking about long distance activities, talking about the aerobic zone, 60 to 80% of maximum heart rate, talking about the time, at least 15 minutes. Right, so that is the end of the Year 10 exam review. I hope you found it useful. I hope it's helped you to understand where you've dropped marks and how you could improve your exam technique in the future. So use it as a resource, and if there's anything you've got questions about, please don't hesitate to come and ask me in school.